For those who don't know me, I'm Natalie Fenton. I work at Goldsmiths as a Professor of Media and Communications, and I'm also one of the founding members of the Media Reform Coalition. And this session is all about the BBC, which has been in the news quite a lot recently. So the title of the session is Another Century of the BBC, Reimagining Public Service Media. All of you will know some of the reasons why we're talking about this right now, but literally in the last week or so, we've had the stuff around Gary Lineker. We've also, of course, have the controversial appointment or knowledge came to bear about Richard Sharp as the chair of the BBC, who has had facilitated a loan for Boris Johnson to the tune of 800,000, also has tutored Rishi Sunak at Goldman Sachs and before landing the job. And then, of course, the whole Lineker row over impartiality, Gary Lineker being a football pundit on Match of the Day who comments on a controversial government policy on asylum seekers and refugees crossing the channel in small boats on Twitter, and is then asked to, when he refuses to apologise, is asked to step down from his presenting role. So, when that happened, of course, there was a big furore about, well, why doesn't Alan Sugar get the same treatment when he comes out with all sorts of pro-Conservative Party material on his Twitter feed. All of this draws into question issues around the independence of the BBC from government. The BBC is also still undergoing a mid-term charter review that reports in 2024, and public service broadcasting in general, despite the fact that Channel 4 is no longer going to be privatised, public service broadcasting still remains under threat. So should we care, is the question of this session. Do we want another century of the BBC? And if so, what do we want it to look like? I'm delighted to welcome Marcus Ryder and Roger Bolton to esteemed guests to this panel. I'll give a brief introduction, then ask a couple of questions, and then over to you. So please get your questions ready. Marcus is a journalist with over 25 years of experience. He's also chair of RADA. I think you're still chair of RADA?
Still chair
of RADA.
They have a very good cafe that just opened up and it's across the road.
And a leading authority in media diversity. He's the head of external consultancies at the Lenny Henry Centre for Media Diversity, a research institute dedicated to increasing diversity and inclusion in the UK media industry. Roger is a former BBC executive, editor of Panorama and other current affairs programmes, of course. He presented feedback for Radio 4 for many years, and claim to fame is he has been fired twice by the BBC, I understand, and now hosts the excellent Beeb Watch podcast, examining the issues that are facing the BBC and public service broadcasting. So to begin with, Roger, in January you wrote a Guardian article that addressed the lack of vision for public service media. You called for a proper cross-party independent inquiry into the future of public service broadcasting and how to pay for it. And you also suggested, which is a common theme in your remarks, that the BBC needs to listen rather more to what the public want it to be. But for now, to kick us off, I'd like to hear whether you have an alternative vision and just how much, if at all, you think the BBC should really change.
Whoa. I hope this discussion will be in two parts. The first part, I hope, will be about what we dream of, and I hope the second part, which is what we think is attainable in the next 4 to 5 years, and practical ideas for improving the present situation, which may not be ideal, but actually, particularly if we have a new incoming Labour government, we can do something about. So on the larger vision, I think that the question, we always start in the wrong place. The question ought to be is, do we still need public service broadcasting? Followed by, if so, and we have to argue what that is, how best should it be delivered? How should we pay for it? And then, of course, in the end, how much should we pay? But we ought to start with a vision, if we can have one, of public service broadcasting. The BBC, as you know, didn't have one when it started. BBC started way back in the 1920s because the radio industry, in growing pains then, wanted to be able to sell more radio sets, needed programs that people would want to listen to in order to buy the radio sets. And it didn't have any form of competition. But it also operated at a time when there was, at least among the establishment, a consensus about what the British or the public interest was. I don't think that was representative of people as a whole, but a consensus of that establishment. The cracks appeared in the 50s when with Suez and so on, and where ITV started. And that old quotation was put forward that when the country is divided, the BBC is on the rack. BBC wants two contradictory things on the whole. It wants to be regarded as independent, but it also wants to be regarded as the national broadcaster. It gets itself, therefore, terribly mixed up about how it should deal with royalty and so on. But now we're in a very different place. I mean, I used to think, because I was born 1,000 years ago, and I thought that by the end of the 1970s or 1960s, all the major things that are going to happen in the world had happened because they'd gone to the moon and we had cars and everything else. The digital revolution, of course, as people have said, is on the level with what happened with Caxton and so on. What we haven't had, so what we've had is Channel 4 here, the BBC here since the 1920s, Channel 4, the other alleged public service broadcaster, here since the beginning of the 1980s. We still have a regulated system for Channel 4 and Channel 3. And what happened with all those things is they're growing with their own interests. And the most important thing for those organizations is to survive. And they'll do anything to survive, like any organization. What is absent is a vision or an inquiry into what public service broadcasting should be going forward. And of course, that has to take account of things like market failure. We can see that in local journalism, with the collapse of a lot of local journalism, which to my mind strengthens dramatically the case for community radio and forms of BBC local radio. So we can see market failure, but we can also see vast increase of choice, which is largely popular, provided by the market. Now, therefore, I think public service broadcasting, which I still think is essential, needs to rethink itself. We could probably all agree on a number of basics. I hope we could, even if we think they're very difficult to achieve. And at the centre of those would be concern for minorities, although minorities change over time. And when we look at Channel 4, we may think that the minorities thought of in 1980 are not exactly the minorities now. So we need to look at that, how to protect minorities. We want the most impartial news service we can deliver. Now, there are arguments about how we achieve that. But above all, I think, we want to make sure that whatever changes we propose still leave public service broadcasting popular and at the heart of broadcasting. Just look at the States if you want to be scared stiff. 70% of Republicans believe that Donald Trump was cheated in the election and that the polls are rigged. And the reason they do that is because they're in echo chambers, they're in silos. We now know from the release of documents that Rupert Murdoch and those running Fox knew the truth about this. They don't share the view that Trump was robbed, but they won't change or say that publicly or instruct their journalists to report properly because it will hit their profits. So anybody who thinks that 1,000 flowers bloom and it's okay should think hard about what's happened there. You're well aware of the dangers of a state broadcaster. We can see that in Russia. We can see that increasingly in India and other places in the world. So there's still a battle to be fought for a public service broadcasting which is popular, which is public. Now, what should be at its heart? I would have a set of views, but you would have a set probably of different views. So that's why I think what we need now is a proper Commission on Public Service Broadcasting, where we ask these difficult questions. It's not about the future of the BBC or Channel 4. It's about the future of public service broadcasting. Then we look and say, how do we best deliver it? We've got the BBC, we've got Channel 4. Can we alter them or redirect them in ways which would be acceptable? And do we need to strengthen at the community level, and it wouldn't cost that much, a number of other projects? I have some views, but I don't want to impose them, because I want us to all, if we can, get a consensus on the need for this commission, this inquiry, and the most wide-ranging, if we can, examination of what public service means in the age of Netflix. While that is going on, and I won't talk any longer, apart from that, 1 more minute, there are a range of practical suggestions I would like to make later on for things that might be done in the existing system. But I beg you not to just dream. I beg you to plan, which is a different thing.
So Marcus, Roger's dodged it by saying, I'm not going to tell you my views, and I understand why.
Well, I will later on at the end, I'll tell you.
What's your vision?
First of all, it is so nice that Roger has made this distinction between the BBC and public service broadcasting. I've come to so many events where the two are confused, and when people talk about the future of public service broadcasting, it invariably just becomes the future of the BBC. So making that distinction and saying that there are different ways in which public service broadcasting can be delivered and that we should be examining is not said often enough. And so I'm happy that that's been said. So I think we need to look at, to have a vision, I think we need to look at what is the purpose. So we understand the world through the narratives that we tell each other and the narratives that we receive. And so that is through drama, that is through news and current affairs, that's through documentaries and what have you. And so what we need to explore is the idea that those narratives, the profit motive, which Roger has already pointed out, is not the best way to ensure that we have narratives which serve the national interest. And I think that in an increasingly, I'd say, not divided because that's too much of a cliche, but fractured society where people are thinking about multiple identities, we need to go down to a far smaller level. And I think my experience of working in Scotland and being an exec in Scotland for 8 years showed that what we need to do is think about national broadcasting in terms of what do communities want, what does the LGBTQ community want, what does the black community want, what does the disabled community want, what do regional communities want, rather than think of some massive monolith. So I would want to have a public service broadcaster which is in many ways far similar to Germany, where you don't think of one massive monolith, but think about what are the different needs of those communities. That doesn't mean that you don't also pool resources, such as Deutsche Welle and what have you, but you are looking at, I think that the idea that there is one unified nation is difficult for any broadcaster or any service to pull off. And so we need to look at how we service our different communities and recognise that they all play instrumental parts in one nation. So the two are not contradictory, but I think invariably in these debates we think about just these large monolithic nations, and we need to think far more in terms of communities and regions and communities of interest and identities.
Thank you. So we've got some common themes emerging already. I'm going to ask one more question and then throw it out, because I just want to flush this out now because it's bound to come up. So, you mentioned the importance of impartiality, Roger, for public service broadcasting.
Due impartiality, and there's a difference between...
Well, I'm going to mention that,
right.
so let me get to it. But it's because it is a troubled term for many reasons, and it's something the BBC has had to defend over its entire 100-year history. And in its editorial guidelines, it states it's committed to achieving due impartiality in all its output. And that phrase itself is hotly contested, so maybe we'll talk about that. It's also supplemented by in-depth guidelines which provides for controversial subjects. And here it says, for BBC staff and regular BBC presenters or reporters associated with news or public policy related output, it's not normally appropriate for them to present or write personal views on matters of political controversy or controversial subjects. And then it also has guidance on individual use of social media. And it adds that those, in there it says those working for the BBC have an obligation to ensure that the BBC's editorial decisions are not perceived to be influenced by any personal interest or bias. So that raises, as we know from all the debates that we've had over the last week, very interesting questions about the Lineker affair. One, because he was a freelance broadcaster. One, because he was a sports pundit. And next, because his tweet was published on a personal account without any official link to the BBC or Match of the Day. So is this a breach of BBC's impartiality? And this is just to get to the crux of how we're thinking about impartiality, or was it a breach of the right to freedom of expression? And I think those two things are at the heart of this debate.
Well, they are, and you've got a collision of rights there. But by the way, just to say a thing about Marcus, what Marcus was talking about, it to my mind, in terms of public service broadcasting, was a form of narrowcasting, which I think you need alongside broadcasting. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. And I think you can argue for both, but I would still argue for public service in terms of a national broadcaster, mainly because one of the great questions that faces in the future is, can we avoid the worst side, liberal democracy is retreating around the world. Can we avoid the rush into nationalism with all its dangers? Can we have a broadcaster which tries to be a unifying force, while at the same time having lots of individual, if you like, narrowcasting? That seems to be the larger question. Now, on impartiality, I have no time for people who say it's not worth pursuing. Of course, nobody's impartial. But that's rather like saying, because I can't be perfect, I'm not going to try and be good. And as long as you realise you never achieve it, but you're moving towards it, it's a worthwhile ideal. But crucial to that ideal is the constant examination of your own prejudices and of the groupthink of the organisation in which you operate, and the openness to the widest range of other views that can challenge you. But whereas that needs to be done, that doesn't mean we should give up with trying to achieve it. Because what we're talking about in due impartiality is not saying, because somebody says 2 and 2 equals 5, you've got to put them on with a mathematician who says 2 and 2 equals 4. You don't have to say, oh, well, he's going to allege Hitler committed all these crimes. Do we need someone to defend Hitler? It's due impartiality we're talking about. And I think that's a vital thing, because what we now see through social media and elsewhere, in a very small number of letters, are views which scream in headlines. And if we don't have somewhere where people are trying to lay out the arguments so that people, and the facts as far as they can be achieved. Now, it's a great story. Now, when we look at what happened with Gary Lineker, we have a collision here, and the BBC has been far too slow to catch up. And I say there are 3 separate groups of people. There are those who work on BBC News and Current Affairs and journalistic programmes. They should not tweet. Full stop on any controversial other issue, because it will damage the perception of the BBC, and people who want to say, well, they would say that, wouldn't they, will not listen. The second thing is there are a group of people who only occasionally appear on the BBC and short contracts, whatever. Of course they shouldn't sacrifice their right to freedom of speech. The problem is this middle area. And although you make a technical case that Gary Lineker is not on the staff of the BBC, it isn't. I don't think a lot of people watching would do that. He's the highest paid employee. For many people, he is the face of the BBC. And he's using that to push his political views. Now, should he be allowed to do that? Well, let's take the question of immigration and so on. The Conservative government has clearly decided to make that a big issue of the next 18 months to 2 years running into the election. That's why Rwanda, and you may think that those policies are rubbish, but they won't be rubbish in terms of the electoral dividend for the Conservative Party, which is why they're running on it. If every week Gary Lineker, the BBC's most famous face, texts on that, just think of what the consequences are going to be for the BBC. And I would say to Gary, who's extraordinarily well played, who I respect and whose views I largely share, he should stop and calm down and text and tweet about a few other things. We know his views, and not do that. But what you've got is a collision between two principles, and it's the question of how we accommodate those two, which is the difficulty. Everybody's finding their way. But let's ensure at least that those involved in BBC journalism and elsewhere don't tweet on those issues.
Well, disagreement had to come eventually. All right. So if you look,
boring if it did.
Yeah. If you look, right, yeah, it's about due impartiality that you quoted, right? That with due impartiality, it is not normally appropriate for them to present or write personal view content on matters of political controversy. Okay, political controversy is the really important part here, because if the Conservatives say 2 + 2 = 5, right, and the Labour Party says 2 + 2 = 4, it is politically controversial and they decide to run on a platform of saying 2 + 2 = 5, right, it then becomes politically controversial, and you will breach due impartiality as it is written here if you start saying 2 + 2 = 4. Basically,
Not true.
of course it is. How do you define political controversy? If you are breaching the UN Convention, right? If you're breaching the UN Convention, right, and decide to run on an illegal policy, right, pointing that out is the same as pointing out that 2 + 2 does not equal 5. Right? I would argue that due impartiality, as interpreted by the BBC, is really looking at where is the Overton window. Right? I know they will say, no, we will take the science, 2 + 2 does not equal 5. They'll say, no, we'll look at global warming, and if the scientists are saying X. The reason why the BBC is, and BBC always use the example of global warming. They always say, no, it's not about balance, because if you look at the science, right, we are not going to just get some skeptic, some global warming skeptic, and balance them with some global person who believes in global warming. We won't do that, because our due impartiality, we take the science and therefore we look at what's correct. And so therefore we're not just looking, that's the difference between due impartiality and impartiality. I used to believe that. I used to actually believe the BBC line. I'll be honest with you, I'm no longer a convert, because in my experience now, what the BBC is doing is that it looks at the Overton window. And if the Overton window shifts radically to the right or radically to the left, if there is a political controversy that global warming isn't happening, the BBC will balance it. If the politics are there, they will balance absolutely what would have been seen just a couple of years ago as extreme right-wing views on immigration if the politics are there, right? And so I would disagree with Roger with regards to that they're not going to, due impartiality means that they don't have to balance 2 + 2 = 5. If the Prime Minister says 2 + 2 = 5, they will balance it. That's why when Donald Trump tweeted what was a racist tweet and Naga Munchetty said that's a racist tweet, they found against Naga Munchetty because Trump and the government at the time had shifted the Overton window so far to the right.
Could I just...
Right? I would say
you on this?
You can, absolutely, and I'll let you do that. And I don't let you, I'm sure you will. Right? Right? So I would actually argue, right, that what we think of as due impartiality, as interpreted by the BBC, due to this one line of political controversy is whatever a political party wants it to be. Right? And so therefore, due impartiality is not about our news values, which the BBC needs to have and any news organisation needs to have. The BBC is increasingly adrift when it comes to its news values and instead just tries to position itself in the middle of the Overton window, and it's in crisis due to the fact that the political window is so shifting to the right.
Before you come back, Roger, I just want to add a further complexity to the debate, because I think alongside this, we've also got the issue of independence. And I think that plays into the debate. So we had Emily Maitlis in her McTaggart lecture saying that there was an active agent of the Tory party acting as the arbiter of the broadcaster's impartiality code. So independence plays, and that was Robbie Gibb, of course, who has a long association with the Conservative Party and was Director of Communications for Theresa May, and a brother who is a Conservative MP. So there's another factor that plays into the perceptions of impartiality as well as the Overton window, which is independence.
Yeah, I mean, this is going the way I hoped it would, which has me defending the BBC when I'm highly critical of the BBC, very critical of Richard Sharp, deeply unhappy about the way they're running things. But let's deal with the question of impartiality, which I disagree here. I don't think you can't have been watching the same or listening to the same BBC programmes I have, where journalists from the current affairs have gone to Rwanda, for example, and reported on the reality in Rwanda.
No, speaking truth to other people's power. And there's a really...
No, hold on.
Absolutely...
Hold on. We're talking about those things which are facts, where the government or other state things which they claim to be facts, and which journalists in the BBC will still largely go and say, it's true, it's not true.
Absolutely.
Right.
And there's a really good academic report that was published yesterday. I will cite it. I will get it out for you.
Okay, so you've just agreed.
No. It shows that the BBC is really good at impartiality when it comes to governments outside of the UK, where it's not worried about their relationship to the UK. So Rwanda's a brilliant example of that.
No, I can hold on.
Right?
I was using Rwanda in terms of the British government's policy and showing that a great deal of the alleged factual basis of the government's policy is false. Now, that's what they still do, and they should do. But you've got to make a decision. I mean, impartiality is difficult in this sense. When you're dealing with opinion and balance of opinion, it's very difficult. And initially, on the question of climate change, the BBC made a number of very stupid mistakes because its instinct, as you say, is often, oh, we'll have that and we'll have that. So you'd have a climate scientist, a really expert in the field, saying something, and up would come Nigel Lawson, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, who might be fit to talk about the business consequences of decisions, but knows F all about climate change. That is a ludicrous, that's false balance. That isn't impartiality, that's ignorance. At the same time, if you study science at all and the history of science, you see that it normally advances by the radical figure challenging the consensus. Everybody knows the world's flat, whatever it is. The lone voice that's saying, no, it's not, and battles against the church or anything else. So one of the problems that you're doing here in dealing with impartiality is to make sure you're being fair, that you represent as fair as you can the facts as far as they can be established, but that you don't exclude the minority voice, simply it is because it's the minority voice. Now, the BBC makes these mistakes, it's learning on this, but it's still worth trying to do. And the idea that BBC journalists don't go and test policies isn't true. They don't do it sufficiently, perhaps, but it's just not. And you must know that, having worked in Scotland for the length of time you do. You know, if Newsnight gets Jimmy Savile wrong, Panorama loves going after Newsnight and doing a report and revealing what happened. No, the problems are unconscious biases. The problems are not sufficient awareness of partiality, but the principles are on the whole, fine and should be pursued. Now, when it comes to the BBC has always been, it's always said it's independent. It has freedom under license. And in terms of the World Service, as you know, it was, not now entirely, funded by the Foreign Office. So the idea that BBC was independent in a complete sense is rubbish. They weren't financially independent. They needed the charter renewed from they needed the license fee. So there's always been a part of the BBC fixed in the long term, usually in Broadcasting House, trying to maintain proper relationships, improper in some senses, good relationships with the governing parties so that they will get the license fee, whatever. There then has been, on the whole in the past, a pretty big barrier beneath which the journalists have tried to be as impartial and independent as they could. And what has happened, in my view, in the last 4 or 5 years is that's got dangerously blurred. We have a chairman who should have resigned by now. We have Robbie Gibb, who's behaved disgracefully. But I would just caution you, think back 20 years. The chairman of the BBC was a Labour supporter and donor, Gavin Davies, married to Sue Nye, who was the closest person politically to Gordon Brown. The Director General was Greg Dyke, who was a past Labour supporter and donor. And Peter Mandelson and Alistair Campbell were on the phone, as you will know. This is not a Conservative Labour issue.
No, absolutely not.
That is a political issue where you have to fight every day for the independence of the BBC, and far more people than are given credit for do so. But I think that the present chairman should have resigned long form now because of this. Sorry.
A great start to the debate. Some hot themes come out already, but really we've got half an hour and I really want you folks to get in on the debate and have a say. I've seen Deb's over here.
I said it gets itself screwed up over the royalty because it's trying to do two contradictory things. I agree with you, but I would also expect Channel 4, for whom you worked when the coronation's on, to put a Republican programme on against the BBC's coverage of royalty, because what you need, and I'm sure you would agree, Simon, is you need competition even within public service. And that was the brilliance 40 years ago of a setup where you had the BBC, ITV and Channel 4, and all of them not competing for the same financial resources, but having different resources. And Channel 4 in itself, positioning itself as a Republican organisation, programme makers in some ways.
The problem with that model
that's key is the funding. What we're actually talking about is funding for public service media. What should it be?
There is an editorial problem with what you've just described, Roger. The editorial problem is that the BBC, in that kind of Republican monarchy debate, is seen as being the voice and capturing the temperature of the nation, while Channel 4 is seen as the kind of minority sitting slightly outside the nation. Now, I want to be a Republican, or I want to support, I don't know, whatever issue it is. I want to either hate immigrants or love immigrants, right? And not.
I don't want you to.
Or I'm just saying on a personal. I'm just saying, or I said hate or love love Ukrainian immigrants over whatever it is, right? And not feel that I'm not part, that I'm any less British, right? And the trouble with outsourcing the minority view to Channel 4 or to another channel, right, means that the BBC is whether you're British, and the other people, Channel 4, is you're not quite British.
I wasn't advocating that. I was saying the principle of competition in public service broadcasting is essential. I'd be highly critical myself of the BBC's sycophantic treatment of royalty, while recognising there's a very substantial part of the British population which wants to see these outside broadcasts. And I would also say, I'm sorry...
But I'm saying they need to be within the BBC.
Yeah, well, I did. I mean, 20 years ago, and I'm sorry it's 20 years ago, I did a series called The Radical Option, and one of the programmes was called Elizabeth the Last, in which we examined the case. The idea was you examined the case for the alternative, and we did that. Now, I wish there were more of those programmes, but nobody tried to stop me. And you've got to, I think the other thing, picking up Simon's point, what you've outlined is something, an ideal. But it's like that line in Shakespeare when they're talking about in Henry IV, and said, I can summon X from the deep. And then they reply, yeah, but will they come when you summon them? You've described a situation of what people ought to want. But the fact is, unless you have a lot of money and a lot of very skilled program makers, you won't get an audience. So you all the time have to balance what you want in an ideal sense with an examination of the resources required to make really good programming and the way in which you can inspire the best directors and creative figures. And you can't instruct often the best dramatists and dramatists to write what you think they should. You can give them the space to write what they want. And sorry, I'll go on, forgive me.
I'm going to take a couple more questions. There's so much to be said here.
Well, first of all, the idea that you can suppress BBC journalists is a very difficult. They're a rebellious load of buggers, actually, and fortunately. But what the problem is, you can scare them off. And I think the big failure, and you are partisan, if I may say so, on the Israel-Palestine issue from what I've read. Now,
can you explain what you mean by that?
I mean that you are particularly concerned about one side of a complex issue. You haven't misrepresented anything, but from what I've read of what you said, you have a particular position which is absolutely valid one, but it is a position in a contested area. What I say, the BBC is where the BBC's failed, is not in its reporting so much but the fact that it didn't, on the question of Israel, it should have mounted programs which said, when does the criticism of Israel move from being criticism of Israel to being anti-Semitic? Now, we can recognize that the Israeli government will always allege that criticism about it is anti-Semitic in its nature. It'll do that.
I'm sorry, Roger, I'm not satisfied with your response.
Well, I haven't finished it yet. Can I just say?
What you need to look at is statistics.
No, what I'm saying is that if I may say so.
Instead of qualitative stuff, you need to look at statistics on attitudes and behaviour. Nobody, including yourself, is doing that.
Well, what I think hasn't been done in this debate, and it is the role of the BBC to do it, and it didn't do it, was to clarify these issues. What is anti-Semitism? Where does it move into or inhibit proper criticism of Israel? Is the Palestinian position being properly represented? And it should examine these issues, and it should also address Palestinian anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism in the Arab world, which exists, undoubtedly. Now, my criticism of the BBC on the whole is that it, just as in the Brexit debate, it didn't do stage 2 of the Brexit debate, which should be, stage 1, what don't you like about being a member of the European Union? Stage 2 is, what are the alternatives? Are they better? And by the way, what are the motives of those people who want us to leave? Great Singapore on Thames. It's more that the intellectual inquiry isn't there. And the BBC should have seized on this issue and say, we're doing all this reporting about alleged anti-Semitism in the Labour Party on the left. Where is the programme that says what constitutes anti-Semitism? They didn't do it.
More questions.
First of all, there are some brilliant BBC journalists, and they will challenge and they will investigate power as they see it. Right? I myself have overseen investigations into abuse of finances by the royal family. That does not mean that the BBC did not do blanket wall-to-wall coverage of basically without being uncritical of the royal family when the Queen died. And so I think that there needs to be a distinction when I criticise the way that the BBC interprets due impartiality and its framing with the way that a lot of its journalists operate when they know that it's investigating a specific issue. Right? So I think it's complex. It's not as easy as thinking that we are in some kind of China or Russia state broadcaster or Turkish state broadcaster where there is diktats on high as to you can't touch this, you can't touch that. It is more complex than that, and which is why I say that you need to look at the general culture, which is about looking at where the Overton window is and where that shifts and how politics and the main political parties can actually shift that Overton window, which then shifts the culture of what is seen as in day-to-day reporting or what can be fair comment as with regards to impartiality. So there's a subtle distinction there. With regards to climate change, as the woman at the top said, I think that the BBC says that it's because there's a scientific consensus. I suspect that the BBC reports on climate change being a fact because there is a political consensus. Because if you look at the IPPR and what have you, there's a general global political consensus of most right-thinking politicians that climate change is happening. There's a few radical people here and there who thinks that climate change isn't happening, but I think it's the political consensus which enables the BBC, and I think that even if there was a scientific consensus, if there was not a political consensus, it would become a politically controversial issue, and then we would have problems. That would not stop BBC journalists from actually doing a really good job and being able to do panoramas and what have you, but it would stop somebody tweeting saying, I believe there's climate change. All right? So there's a distinction between the two. With regards to my model of narrowcasting, or whether we're talking about national, you do combine the two, but I also think that it's a false binary to think that you either have narrowcasting or you have to think of narrowcasting and you need to think of the national model working in tandem, or you do both. You know, the old ITV model was very, very strong with regards to different regions and pooling resources and pooling programs while getting the best out of those regions. I think that now, whereas regional identity was really important to people and still is really important to people, I think other forms of identity are equally important to people, such as their protected characteristics. You didn't have the Equality Act of 2010 by definition of its title before 2010, which actually shows that protected characteristics are possibly as important, if not more important. Right? So just as we recognise the need for a BBC Scotland, BBC Wales feeding into that, feeding into the national discourse, when you actually devolve that, I think that's a broadcaster or a national broadcaster that I would like to see, where there's more devolved power, but that doesn't mean that you're then descending emotive term, but you're not then turning to narrowcasting. So in summary, because I'm assuming this is a sum up, right? So in summary, right, I think that public service broadcasting is absolutely needed. We only need to listen to the last podcast of Planet Money with regards to how the streaming economic model seems to be falling apart right now, and so we need to be careful if we're relying on different profit motives and economic motives to deliver us the public good, and media is a public good when it comes to democracy and lots of other things. So we really desperately need public service broadcasting. I do think that we need to re-examine due impartiality and how we actually define it, because the minorities are the people that often pay the price for, or minority opinions, or opinions that champion the minority, are the people that pay for the current interpretation of due impartiality. Real quickly, the BBC has U-turned, in the last 3.5 years, has U-turned on 3 big editorial issues. The first is Naga Munchetty talking about racism. The second is the N-word, of a reporter using the N-word. And the third is Gary Lineker talking about immigration, which is a heavily racialized issue. It is no coincidence, in my mind, right, and we haven't got time now because Roger needs to have at least some time to speak, right? It's no coincidence that those 3 big U-turns are heavily racialized, and I would say there is a 4th U-turn, which the BBC does not call a U-turn, but calls a clarity, said that it was clarifying its position, which is when it banned its reporters from going on pride marches. It then, if you actually read the original press release, it really looks like a U-turn. The BBC is at pains to say it wasn't a U-turn, that it's a clarification, right? But it's no coincidence that those big editorial U-turns, stroke clarifications, have all been about the rights of minorities. And I think the BBC and public service broadcasting, as due impartiality is currently defined, really struggles with minorities.
Roger, 2 minutes. Thank you.
Right, okay. I can't address those questions because I'm afraid, but I'm very sympathetic to a lot of it. First of all, you don't have to be impartial about facts. The debate and the controversy comes really about the policies that should be taken in the light of the facts. And certainly when it comes to trying to establish the facts, I think on the whole BBC journalists do a reasonably good job. I didn't want this conversation to be about the BBC, but it has become about that. I do passionately believe in the need for national conversations. We are more fragmented than almost we've ever been. And we've got to find ways of talking to each other. And what goes on so often is people are condemning others as being racist or whatever they are when they're actually ignorant. Not their fault that they are. I come from Cumberland. 98% of the people in Cumberland are white. They don't have the experiences that we have every day here or meet people. You don't call them racist. You devise ways of having a conversation with them and involving them. You get older people who have been left behind in some of the conversations about sexuality and changes. They need to be talked to. They don't need to be shouted at and told they're sexist. So we need to have a way of having a national conversation. Now, when it comes to I've talked about the need at the beginning for a proper debate and inquiry about public service broadcasting. But in the short term, what can we do? Well, the first thing is, in terms of the BBC, you stop the chairman being appointed by ministers, and that means by the Prime Minister. This present chairman resigns, you don't have the chairman appointed by Prime Minister. Secondly, you explore whether, like the National Trust, you could have 2 or 3 non-executive directors of the BBC elected. If the National Trust is able to do that, which it can by going to its members, why can't we do the same? We could also ensure that there's no member who represents the trade union movement on the BBC non-executive directors. As you know, there used to be 2 boards, governors or whatever. There's now a single board. They have the executives, they have the chairman, and they have non-executives, 3 of whom represent Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. There's one vaguely represents the arts. But you look at it, and it's more racially diverse than its Channel 4 board, but it's not representative. So we should look at the possibility they have a trade union member. We should look at least 2 members of the BBC board being elected and explore those techniques. I'm staggered when you look at Channel 4. Channel 4 needs, the whole board is white. It represents the established interests. And there's been in my view, no real articulation, fresh articulation of what Channel 4 should be for. If you take Jeremy Isaac's original pitch in 1980-81 for the channel, and you look at the book he wrote at the end of his tenure there, so much of that is true and valid, but quite a lot is out of date. And that sort of thinking has not been done. Now, Channel 4 directors are appointed by Ofcom. Ofcom has its chair, a politically appointed figure, Michael Grade, who was now in favour of privatisation in Channel 4, who's now a Tory peer and whatever. Again, I would like the way in which Channel 4 directors are appointed to be looked at, but it certainly should start by saying, this is a scandal, it's not more diverse. So let's analyse, I'm going to stop in 5 seconds, practical steps, and then have the other argument at the same time.
Thank you very much.